The night sky above the ancient city of Iskorosten was not black. It was not filled with the comforting, passive twinkle of distant stars, nor the silver wash of the moon. It was a pulsating, living orange, a chaotic tapestry woven from fire and screaming. If you had stood on the ramparts that night in the year 946 AD, you would not have just seen the destruction. You would have smelled the sulfur choking the air, a scent so sharp it tasted like copper on the tongue. You would have heard the unnatural high-pitched shrieks of thousands of birds, sparrows and pigeons, ignited like living torches, frantically flying back to their nests in the thatched roofs of the wooden houses below. It was a scene of apocalyptic beauty, a rain of fire delivered not by gods, but by tiny, terrified creatures. And as the city began to collapse into a heap of ash and bone, one woman watched from the safety of a distant ridge. She did not smile. She did not weep. She stood with the stillness of a statue carved from glacial ice. Her name was Olga, and she was not merely watching a military victory. She was watching the final stroke of a masterpiece painted in blood. History is filled with tales of vengeance. We are told stories of men who marched to war to reclaim lost honor, of kings who salt the earth of their enemies. But the story of Olga of Kiev is different. It is colder. It is more intimate. It is the story of a woman who was pushed into the abyss of grief and instead of drowning, decided to build a throne there. They made the mistake of killing the man she loved. They tore him apart, literally ripping his body in two with bent birch trees. But their fatal error was not the murder itself. Their fatal error was the audacity of what came next. They looked at the grieving widow, a woman alone in a brutal world of warlords, and they saw a prize. They saw weakness. They sent messengers to her court, smiling and confident, proposing that she marry the very man who had slaughtered her husband. Imagine the silence in her great hall when that proposal was made. Imagine the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light, settling on the heavy furs of her cloak. Olga did not rage. She did not order her guards to strike them down where they stood. That would have been too quick, too merciful. Instead, she smiled. She told them their offer was an honor. She told them to return the next day, carried in their boat by her own servants, so that her people might see how highly she esteemed them. The next morning, as the sun warmed the damp earth of Kiev, those messengers sat proudly in their boat, carried on the shoulders of strong men. They believed they were being elevated to royalty. They did not notice that the procession was leading them not to the palace, but to a gaping wound in the earth, a deep, freshly dug trench in the courtyard. When the realization hit, it was instantaneous and visceral. The boat was tossed into the pit. As the soil began to rain down upon them, heavy and suffocating, Olga leaned over the edge. She looked down at their terror-stricken faces, their fine clothes now soiled with the grave dirt, and she asked them with a voice as soft as a mother putting a child to sleep, if this honor was to their liking. We are told that their screams were muffled slowly, shovel by shovel, until the ground was flat once more. But she wasn't finished. That was just the prologue. She sent word for the highest nobles of the enemy land to come to her, feigning interest in the marriage. When they arrived, dusty from the road, she offered them a bathhouse to cleanse themselves before the feast. She waited until the steam was thick, until their naked bodies were relaxed in the heat, surrounded by the smell of wet wood and herbs. Then she ordered the doors barred from the outside. She ordered the torches applied to the timber walls. She listened as the crackle of dry wood was overtaken by the pounding of fists against the door, and finally, by the silence of smoke and ash. And then came the birds, the sulfur. The city of Iskorosten turned to a funeral pyre. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a myth conjured to scare children. This is the historical record of the woman who would become known as Saint Olga. Yes, Saint. In the Orthodox Church, she is venerated as equal to the apostles. Her face, the same face that watched men burn and suffocate, is painted in gold leaf on icons, illuminated by the flicker of holy candles in cathedrals across Russia and Ukraine today. How does a mind reconcile these two images? The monster who buried men alive and the saint who brought Christianity to the East. To understand her, we must peel back the layers of time. We must walk through the muddy streets of the 10th century, smell the iron of the swords, feel the biting wind of the steppes, and look into the heart of a woman who loved so fiercely that she burned the world down to prove it. We are about to descend into the darkest chapter of the Kievan Rus, a narrative so violent and psychologically complex that it feels like modern fiction. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. Not just to help the channel, but because every interaction tells YouTube that stories like this deserve to be told. Now let us turn back the clock. Let us wipe away the soot and the blood and find the girl before she became the legend. Let us find the silence before the scream. To understand the fire that would eventually consume entire cities, we must first understand the ice. Long before the crown, before the blood-soaked bathhouses and the buried messengers, Olga was a creature of the cold. She was born into the silence of the north, in the region of Pskov, a land where the winters were not merely a season, but a living, breathing tyrant that demanded respect. Imagine a world painted entirely in shades of slate, charcoal, and white. The mist here clings to the ground like a shroud, damp and heavy, smelling of wet pine needles and the deep, churning mud of the riverbanks. This was Olga's kingdom long before she sat on a throne. She was not a princess waiting in a high tower. Legend tells us she was a ferrywoman on the river Velikaya. Picture her there, not as the terrifying matriarch of history, but as a young woman with hands calloused from the rough wood of the oars. Her skin would have been wind-chapped, her eyes scanning the grey horizon, accustomed to the biting wind that whipped off the water and stung the face like tiny needles. There is a profound solitude in that kind of life. When you spend your days traversing the water, the only sounds are the rhythmic splash of the oars, the creaking of timber, and the cry of waterbirds echoing in the fog. It breeds a specific kind of temperament. You learn patience. You learn to read the currents, the hidden dangers swirling beneath the flat, deceptive surface. You learn that one wrong move, one moment of panic, can capsize you into the freezing blackness. Olga learned early that survival required a steady hand and a heart that did not tremble. It was on this river, amidst the reeds and the grey water, that destiny arrived. It did not come with a fanfare of trumpets, but with the heavy hoofbeats of a hunting party. Prince Igor of Kiev. He was young, flush with the power of his lineage, a Rurikid prince used to taking what he desired. When he arrived at the riverbank, needing passage, he saw the ferryman, but as the hood was pulled back, he saw her. History often romanticizes these meetings, painting them with the soft brushstrokes of a fairy tale. But let us look at the reality. Igor was a warrior in a time when women were often treated as spoils of war, mere objects to be collected. When he looked at the young Olga rowing him across the water, his thoughts turned to lust. He saw beauty in the wilderness and thought it was his for the taking. He spoke to her, words likely laced with entitlement and suggestion. But Olga did not cower. She did not giggle or blush. She stopped rowing. In the middle of that freezing river, with the mist isolating them from the rest of the world, she looked the Prince of Kiev in the eye. She spoke not with the fear of a peasant, but with the dignity of an equal. She reminded him of his station, of his honor as a prince and a protector, shaming him for his base desires. It was a moment of electrifying tension, the water lapping against the hull, the breath of the two young people hanging in the freezing air like smoke. In that moment, Igor realized something that would define the rest of his life. This was not a woman to be taken. This was a woman to be earned. He left her there on the riverbank, but he could not leave the memory of her behind. When the time came for him to choose a bride, to choose the woman who would sit beside him and rule the vast, unruly lands of the Rus, he sent for the girl from Pskov. Leaving her home meant leaving the silence. Kiev was a shock to the senses, a cacophony of life and grime. It was a trading metropolis where the muddy streets smelled of exotic spices from Byzantium, unwashed bodies, roasting meat, and horse manure. It was a place of loud voices, clashing swords, and political intrigue. For a girl used to the whisper of the river, it must have been overwhelming. Yet she adapted. She traded her rough wool tunics for heavy furs and embroidered silks, the weight of gold jewelry replacing the weight of the oars. But the most important thing she found in Kiev was not power, it was partnership. Igor and Olga were not merely a political match, they became a singular entity. In a world where treachery lurked behind every smile, they were each other's sanctuary. Imagine the intimacy of the evenings in the wooden palace, the fire in the hearth crackling, casting long, dancing shadows on the log walls. This was the only place they could unmask. Igor, the Grand Prince, weary from the constant demands of the Druzhina, his elite guard, and the endless skirmishes to maintain control. And Olga, the sharp-minded counselor, the one person whose loyalty was absolute. They grew up together in that marriage. They built a life. And then the bond deepened further with the arrival of a child, Sviatoslav. To see Olga as a mother is to see the crack in the armor she would later weld shut. Picture her holding the infant, the softness of his cheek against hers, the smell of milk and warm skin, a stark contrast to the cold iron and rough stone of their world. Sviatoslav was the physical manifestation of her love for Igor. He was their future. Every time she looked at the boy, she saw his father's eyes. This love was not passive. It was fierce, protective, and all-consuming. She was no longer just surviving for herself. She was building a dynasty. For years, there was a semblance of happiness. Or if not happiness, then stability. The seasons turned. The snows melted into mud, the mud hardened into summer roads, and the harvest came. Igor would leave to collect tributes, the Polyudi, riding out with his men to gather furs, honey, and wax from the subject tribes. It was a routine, a cycle of life in the Rus. When he rode out that final winter, the air was crisp and clear. The snow crunched under the hooves of his horse. Olga would have stood at the gates of Kiev, watching the procession disappear into the white horizon, her breath misting in the air, pulling her furs tighter against the chill. She had watched him leave 100 times before. There was no reason to think this time would be different. There was no omen in the sky, no blood on the moon, just the quiet confidence of a woman who loved a man, believing that he would return to her as he always had. She did not know that the thread of their lives was about to be snapped. She did not know that the Drevlians, a tribe resentful of the high tributes, were waiting in the frozen forests of Iskorosten. She did not know that the man she had watched row away from the riverbank all those years ago, the father of her child, the other half of her soul, was riding toward a death so horrific it would shatter her humanity. She was still the girl from the ice, but the ice was about to crack, and what lay beneath was a darkness deeper than the river bottom. The silence of Pskov was gone. The screaming was about to begin. We must ask ourselves, what drives a man to walk willingly into the mouth of a wolf? What is the specific texture of the madness that overtakes a rational mind, blinding it to the obvious glint of the blade waiting in the dark? For Prince Igor, it was not merely greed. To call it greed is too simple, too pedestrian. It was a hunger. a gnawing, cavernous emptiness in the gut that no amount of gold, fur, or honey could ever truly fill. The winter of 945 AD was punishing. The snow in the Drevlian forests was waist-deep, a white ocean that swallowed sound and movement. Igor and his druzhina, his elite guard of hardened warriors, had already completed the Polyudi, the annual circuit of tribute collection. Their sleighs were groaning under the weight of the spoils. Black sable furs, jars of golden honey, wax for the candles of Byzantium. It was a successful harvest. By all logic, by all laws of survival, the mission was complete. The horses were tired. The men were dreaming of the hearth fires of Kiev and the warm mead that awaited them. But as the procession turned back toward the capital, something began to itch in the back of Igor's mind. It started as a whisper, a doubt planted perhaps by the envious glance of a lieutenant, or perhaps by his own insecurity. Was it enough? The other warlords, the other princes, did they have more? Was his display of power truly absolute? The silence of the forest seemed to mock him. The wealth in the sleighs suddenly looked paltry. The obsession took hold, a fever of the ego. He halted the column. The breath of the horses plumed in the freezing air as he made the decision that would doom them all. He ordered the main bulk of his army to continue home with the loot. He, however, would turn back. He would return to Iskorosten, the Drevlian capital, with only a small, intimate escort. He would demand more. It was a violation of the unspoken contract between ruler and ruled. You shear the sheep, you do not skin them. But Igor was drunk on his own invincibility. He believed that his name alone was a shield that could not be pierced. He rode back into the heart of the enemy territory, not as a king, but as a parasite refusing to detach. Inside the wooden walls of Iskorosten, the Drevlians watched him come. They saw the small number of guards. They saw the arrogance in Igor's posture. Their leader, Prince Mal, gathered his elders. The air in their council hut would have been thick with smoke and fear. They spoke in low, desperate tones. They used a metaphor that has survived through the centuries, a chilling piece of rustic wisdom. If a wolf enters the sheepfold, he will kill the entire flock unless he is killed. They knew that if they paid him again, he would return next year, and the year after, until there was nothing left but bones. The decision was made. It was not war, it was extermination. When the ambush sprang, it was sudden and overwhelming. Igor's small guard was swallowed up instantly, cut down in the snow before they could even draw their swords. But for the Grand Prince, the Drevlians had reserved a special, theatrical cruelty. They did not just want him dead, they wanted to make a statement. They wanted to dismantle the myth of the Rurikid power, quite literally. Imagine the scene in that clearing. The winter trees, tall and flexible birches, standing like silent witnesses against the grey sky. The Drevlians seized two of these massive trees. With ropes and the brute strength of dozens of men, they bent the trunks down until the treetops touched the ground. The wood groaned and popped, storing an immense, terrifying kinetic energy. It was a loaded weapon of nature. They dragged Igor forward. He was likely battered, stripped of his fine armor, his royal furs torn. They tied one of his legs to the first tree. They tied the other leg to the second. He was suspended there, splayed out on the frozen earth, a man caught between two tensions. He would have looked up at the faces of the men he had tried to rob, seeing no mercy, only the cold, hard stare of survival. Then, at a signal, the ropes were cut. The trees whipped back upright with a sound like a thunderclap. The violence was instantaneous. The physics of it is nauseating to contemplate. The body of the Grand Prince of Kiev was torn asunder. He was ripped in half, his blood spraying the white snow in a gruesome arc, a horrific red signature on the land he sought to exploit. News travels differently in the ancient world. It does not arrive with a notification ping. It arrives with the slow, dreadful cadence of a lone rider, or a rumor carried on the wind that chills the blood before the words are even spoken. In Kiev, Olga was waiting. She was the anchor, the stillness at the center of the spinning world. When the word finally reached her, perhaps whispered by a terrified survivor, or perhaps delivered with grim satisfaction by a Drevlian scout, the impact was not an explosion. It was an implosion. Consider the psychology of this moment. If Igor had died in battle, struck by an arrow while leading a charge, she would have mourned him as a hero. She would have built a mound, feasted in his honor, and raised their son to be like him. That is the death of a soldier. But this was the death of a fool, executed like a criminal, dismantled like a piece of meat. The Drevlians had not just killed her husband, they had obliterated his dignity. They had turned the father of her child into a grotesque warning sign. And in doing so, they had underestimated the woman who sat in the high chair of Kiev. They thought they had cut off the head of the snake. They did not realize they had merely woken the dragon. The pain that flooded Olga's chest was not the soft, weeping grief of a widow. It was a cold, hard, vitrified agony. It was a paralysis that lasted only a moment before it calcified into something else. Purpose. She looked at her son, little Sviatoslav, barely a toddler playing on the floor with wooden toys. He was now the Grand Prince, but he was a child. The vultures would be circling. The Drevlians, emboldened by their kill, would come for everything. They would come for her city. They would come for her son. A terrifying clarity descended upon her. The love she held for Igor, that fierce, river-born connection, did not vanish. It curdled. It transformed into a fuel source of limitless potency. She realized that to survive, and to ensure her son survived, she could not simply defeat the Drevlians. She had to become a nightmare so vivid, so absolute, that no one would ever dare look at her family with greed in their eyes again. She sat in the deepening twilight of the palace, the fire dying in the hearth, and she stopped being a wife. She stopped being a mother. In the silence of that room, surrounded by the ghosts of her happiness, Olga began to sharpen the knife of her mind. The passion was still there, burning hotter than ever, but now its name was vengeance, and it would be a vengeance that the world would never forget. The audacity of Prince Mal and the Drevlian elders is something that even 1,000 years later feels breathtakingly arrogant. Having just torn the Grand Prince of Kiev into 2 bloody pieces, they sat in their timber halls in Iskorosten and decided that the natural next step was a wedding. It was a calculation born of a brutal, patriarchal logic. In their eyes, Olga was not a ruler. She was a remnant. She was a piece of property left unguarded, a valuable asset with a vacancy sign hanging around her neck. "We have killed the husband," they reasoned, amidst the smell of stale beer and roasting pork, "so let us marry the widow." By marrying Olga to Prince Mal, they would not only avoid retribution, but would absorb the entirety of the Kievan Rus into their own domain. They would take the victim's wife, his son, his lands, and his legacy. It was the ultimate hostile takeover. So they sent their best men, 20 of them. These were not lowly foot soldiers. These were the cream of the Drevlian nobility. Men with grey in their beards, scars on their knuckles, and cloaks trimmed with the finest furs. They were men accustomed to respect, men who believed their sheer presence commanded authority. They traveled down the Dnieper River by boat. The journey would have been slow, the water sluggish and grey under the leaden sky of early spring. The ice was breaking up, creating jagged floating islands that bumped against the hull with dull, hollow thuds. As they approached Kiev, they must have felt a swell of pride. They were coming as conquerors in the guise of suitors. They imagined a terrified, weeping woman who would be grateful for their protection. They imagined the keys to the city being handed over without a fight. When they arrived at the docks of Kiev, the air was thick with tension. The Kievan guards stood silent, their faces unreadable masks. The Drevlians, swelling with self-importance, refused to walk. "We will not ride on horses nor go on foot," they declared to Olga's emissaries. "Carry us in our boat to your palace." It was an insult wrapped in a demand, a test of dominance. They wanted to be carried like idols, like gods arriving to claim their due. Olga received the message in her great hall. She was dressed in mourning black, her face pale, her eyes dark pools that gave away nothing. She listened to their demands, and then she gave that terrifying, enigmatic smile. "Your proposal is pleasing to me," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Indeed, my husband is dead and cannot be raised. I wish to honor you tomorrow before my people. Return to your boat now, and in the morning I shall send for you." The Drevlians returned to the riverbank, smug and satisfied. They spent the night drinking, congratulating themselves on their diplomatic genius. They did not see the shadows moving in the courtyard of the palace. They did not hear the sound of shovels biting into the earth. All through the night, while the city slept in a fitful, uneasy silence, Olga's men worked. In the center of the stone courtyard, directly in front of the terrace where she would receive her guests, they dug. It was not a grave for one. It was a chasm. They dug until the hole was deep enough to swallow a house, the piles of fresh, damp earth hidden away in the darkness. The smell of the overturned soil, rich, wormy and cold, hung heavy in the air, mingling with the mist. Morning came with a pale, sickly light. The sun struggled to pierce the overcast sky. The Drevlians, still in their boat, waited. When Olga's servants arrived, they lifted the heavy vessel onto their shoulders. The Drevlians sat inside, puffing out their chests, dressed in their finest robes, looking down at the people of Kiev with haughty disdain. They were being paraded, they thought. They were being honored. The procession wound its way up the hill, through the gates, and into the courtyard. Olga sat on the terrace above, wrapped in furs, looking down like a judge at an execution. The carriers marched straight toward the center of the yard, and then, with a synchronized heave, they tipped the boat. The scream was collective. 20 men, the boat, and their arrogance tumbled into the abyss. The crash was sickening. Wood splintering, bodies thudding against the hard earth at the bottom of the pit. Olga stood up. She walked to the edge of the pit and looked down. The hole was deep, the walls steep and slick. The Drevlians were writhing in the mud, bruised, broken, their fine clothes ruined. They looked up at the woman silhouetted against the grey sky, and for the first time they saw the monster they had awoken. "Is the honor to your liking?" she called down. Her voice echoed in the pit. The Drevlians began to plead. They begged for mercy, for ransom, for anything, but the only answer they received was the sound of soil hitting the ground. Olga signaled her men. The shovels began to work again. This was not a quick death. It was slow, brutally, agonizingly slow. The dirt rained down on them, heavy and suffocating. At first they could shake it off, they could stand. But as the level rose, it pinned their legs, then their waists. The panic would have been absolute, clawing at the crumbling walls, gasping for air as the dust filled their lungs. The light from above grew smaller and smaller, a shrinking square of grey sky that represented their last glimpse of the world. We are told that Olga stayed until the end. She stayed until the screams were muffled, until the pleading stopped, until the ground was flat and silent once more. She had buried the embassy alive, but here is where the true darkness of her plan reveals itself. She did not stop. She did not declare war. Instead, she sent a message back to Iskorosten. She told Prince Mal that the first group of ambassadors had arrived safely and that she was considering the proposal. But she added, for such a union to be truly accepted by her people, she needed more. She needed the best men, the governors, the generals, the highest lords of the land. Only with such an escort could she leave Kiev with dignity. It was a lie so audacious that it bypassed suspicion entirely. In Iskorosten, they believed her. They were so blinded by the prospect of gaining power that they stripped their own city of its leadership. They sent their wisest, their strongest, their most powerful men to fetch the bride. As the second group rode toward Kiev, the weather began to turn. The wind howled across the steppes, stripping the last dead leaves from the trees. The sky was a bruised purple, threatening a storm. These men, the elite of the Drevlian nation, rode with their heads high, dreaming of the feast that awaited them. They did not know they were riding into a city that had already become a graveyard. They did not know that the woman waiting for them was not a bride, but an executioner who had only just begun her work. The tension in Kiev was palpable. The people knew. They walked with their heads down, eyes averting the fresh patch of earth in the courtyard. They could feel the storm coming, not from the sky, but from the palace. The air smelled of ozone and impending violence. The shadows were lengthening, and the second act of the tragedy was about to begin. And this time, fire would join the earth. The arrival of the second delegation was a spectacle of grim irony. These were the princes, the governors, the wealthy merchants of the Drevlian lands, men who held the fate of thousands in their hands, yet walked blindly into the open jaws of their own demise. They arrived in Kiev expecting a royal wedding procession. They found only the heavy, expectant silence of a city holding its breath. Olga met them not with the sword, but with the towel. She looked at these men, covered in the grime of the road, their beards matted with dust, and she offered them the ultimate hospitality of the Rus, the banya, the bathhouse. "Wash yourselves," she commanded, her voice stripping them of their authority as easily as they would strip off their clothes. "Cleanse yourselves of the journey, and then come to me. Then we shall speak of the future." The bathhouse was a low timber building, smelling of damp moss, heated stones, and dried birch leaves. The unsuspecting nobles entered, shedding their furs, their silks, and their weapons. They were naked, vulnerable, enveloped in the thick white steam that hissed from the hot rocks. For a moment, there was peace. The heat loosened their tight muscles. They laughed, perhaps joking about the weakness of women, about how easily they had secured the throne. Then came the sound. It was not a loud sound, just the heavy, dull thud of a massive wooden beam dropping into place on the outside of the door. Inside, the laughter died. A confused silence fell. Someone likely tried the handle, rattling the heavy timber. Locked. Then came the smell. Not the clean scent of birch anymore, but the acrid, stinging aroma of smoke. And then the heat changed. It was no longer the therapeutic warmth of the steam. It was an aggressive, blistering heat radiating from the walls themselves. Outside, Olga's men were piling brushwood, straw, and pitch against the logs. They lit the torches. The fire did not roar immediately. It crackled, a hungry, snapping sound that grew louder with every second. Inside the banya, the air turned grey. The men began to pound on the door, their fists bloodying against the wood. They screamed, not the screams of warriors in battle, but the primal, high-pitched shrieks of trapped animals. The fire consumed the oxygen first. The smoke filled their lungs, choking off their pleas. As the walls burned through, the roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and flaming timber, burying the elite of the Drevlian nation in a tomb of ash and roasted flesh. Olga stood outside, watching the flames dance in her dark eyes, listening until the last scream faded into the crackle of the inferno. But the nightmare was not over. It was merely expanding. With the leadership decapitated, Olga moved to the next phase of her masterwork. She traveled to Iskorosten herself. She sent word ahead. "I am coming to you. Prepare the mead, prepare the feast." I wish to weep over my husband's grave before I marry your prince." The Drevlians, still unaware of the fate of their two delegations, believed her. They saw a grieving widow coming to make peace. They prepared a great funeral feast, a trizna, at the burial mound of Prince Igor. The night was dark, illuminated by the flickering light of hundreds of torches. The mead flowed like a river. Olga walked among them, her face a mask of sorrow, pouring the wine herself, encouraging them to drink to the memory of the man they had murdered. She waited. She waited until the eyes of the Drevlian warriors grew glassy. She waited until their speech slurred and their limbs grew heavy with intoxication. The sounds of the forest at night, the crickets, the wind in the pines, were drowned out by the drunken revelry. Then she gave the signal. It was a small gesture, a nod, a raised hand. Her retinue, who had been sipping water while the Drevlians guzzled strong wine, drew their swords. The massacre that followed was intimate and horrific. There was no battle line. It was throat-slitting in the dark. Men were cut down while they laughed. They were stabbed while they stumbled, trying to draw weapons that felt too heavy in their hands. The grass around Igor's grave became slick with blood. The smell of iron mixed with the sickly sweet scent of spilled mead. 5,000 men died that night. 5,000. Olga walked through the carnage, her boots staining red, stepping over the bodies of the men who had thought they could break her, and still Iskorosten did not fall. The survivors retreated behind the city walls, locking the gates. The siege dragged on for a year. The Drevlians were starving, terrified, but the walls were strong. Olga knew that a direct assault would cost too many of her own men. She needed something else. She needed a weapon that could bypass wood and stone. She sent a message to the city elders. Her voice was reasonable, almost motherly. "Why do you persist in dying of hunger?" she asked. "All your other cities have surrendered and are paying tribute. I do not want your destruction. I only want a small token of submission. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house." The Drevlians were relieved. Birds? Just birds? They laughed at the simplicity of the request. They caught the pigeons from the eaves, the sparrows from the thatch. They sent them out in baskets, thinking they had bought their lives with feathers. Twilight settled over the camp. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and black. Olga ordered her soldiers to prepare the gift. They took small pieces of cloth, soaked them in sulfur, and tied them with fine thread to the legs of the birds. "Light them," she whispered. Matches were struck. The sulfur flared with a blue, hissing flame. The birds, terrified by the fire attached to their bodies, were released. Instinct is a powerful force. A pigeon, when released, does not fly into the unknown. It flies home. It flies to the nest it knows. Thousands of birds rose into the darkening sky, a shimmering cloud of living embers. They flew over the walls of Iskorosten. They dove into the pigeon lofts, under the eaves of the wooden houses, into the dry thatch of the barns. The effect was instantaneous. It was not a fire that started in one place and spread. The entire city ignited at once. Every house, every shed, every tower caught fire simultaneously. The sky turned a violent, churning orange. The sound was deafening, the roar of the flames, the shrieking of the birds, and then the screaming of the people. The gates opened, not in surrender, but in panic. The people of Iskorosten flooded out, running from the heat that was melting their skin. But waiting for them in the shadows, illuminated by the glow of their burning homes, were Olga's soldiers. The orders were simple. Kill the elders. Enslave the young. Leave nothing but memory. Olga stood on the ridge, the heat of the burning city warming her face against the night chill. She watched the sparks drift up toward the stars, mingling with the smoke. The vengeance was complete. The debt was paid. The silence of the river had finally come to the fire. The smoke over Iskorosten eventually cleared. The winds of the steppe blew the ash away, scattering the remnants of a civilization across the tall grass. But as the physical fires died down, a new, more perplexing mist began to rise, the mist of history, obscuring the true nature of the woman who held the torch. We are left with a haunting question, a mystery that echoes through the corridors of time. What happens to a soul after it has consumed so much darkness? Does it wither? Does it harden into stone? Or does it, in a twist of profound irony, seek the blinding light? Years after the massacre, Olga did not retreat into the shadows of a tyrant's paranoia. She did something that baffled her contemporaries and continues to puzzle historians. She sailed south. She left the wooden fortresses and muddy rivers of the Rus and entered the golden dreamscape of Constantinople. Imagine the sensory shock for a woman of the north. The Hagia Sophia, rising like a mountain of marble and mosaics, the air heavy with frankincense, and the chanting of 1,000 monks, the shimmer of silk and the glitter of gold on every surface. She stood before the Byzantine emperor, Constantine Porphyrogenitus. The historical records tell us he was captivated by her. He saw her intelligence, her strength and her beauty, which had not dimmed with age, but had sharpened into a regal elegance. He, too, proposed marriage. It seems the world could not stop trying to claim this woman, but Olga was done being claimed. She looked at the Emperor of the Romans, the most powerful man in the known world, and she outmaneuvered him with a weapon sharper than any sword, theology. She asked to be baptized. She asked him to be her godfather. The ceremony was magnificent, the water washing away the pagan past, the holy oil anointing the forehead that had plotted genocide. She took the name Eleanor, and when the emperor, now her godfather, pressed his suit for marriage again, she smiled that same enigmatic smile she had shown the Drevlians. "How can you marry me?" she asked, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. "By your own church law, a godfather cannot marry his goddaughter. It would be incest." The emperor was stunned. He had been checkmated in his own court by a barbarian queen. "Olga," he admitted, "you have outwitted me." She returned to Kiev not as a bride, but as a sovereign equal, carrying the cross of Christ and the political legitimacy of the Byzantine Empire. But was this conversion genuine? This is the heart of the mystery. Did she feel the weight of the 5,000 ghosts of Iskorosten pressing on her chest? Did she wake up at night hearing the screaming of the birds? Or was this simply the final act of her vengeance, a way to secure her legacy and align her people with the greatest power on earth? There is a tragic coda to her life that suggests the transition was not seamless. She had burned the world for her son, Sviatoslav. She had preserved the throne for him with blood and fire. But when she returned from Constantinople, urging him to accept the new faith, he laughed at her. Sviatoslav was a creature of war, a pagan warlord who lived in the saddle and slept on the ground. "My Druzhina would mock me," he told her. The chasm between them grew. The mother who had killed for him could not save him from his own pagan destiny. He would die young, his skull turned into a drinking cup by his enemies, a grim echo of the violence his mother had unleashed. Olga died in 969 AD. She did not die in battle, nor by assassination. She died in her bed, an old woman surrounded by priests. She ordered that there be no funeral feast, no pagan celebration over her grave, just the quiet murmur of prayer. Today, if you walk into an Orthodox cathedral, you will see her. She is there on the iconostasis, painted in 2 dimensions. Her face is serene, her eyes large and sorrowful. She holds a cross. A golden halo rings her head. She is Saint Olga, equal to the apostles. The Church praises her for sowing the seeds of Christianity that her grandson, Vladimir the Great, would eventually harvest to convert the entire nation. But look closer at the icon. Look past the gold leaf and the holy paint. Can you see the shadow behind the saint? Can you smell the sulfur? Her legacy is a paradox that the human mind struggles to hold. She is the mother of Russia and Ukraine's faith, yet she is also the architect of their most horrific folklore. She teaches us that history is not a morality play. It does not reward the kind, it rewards the effective. She showed that a woman pushed to the brink of madness by grief and disrespect could be more terrifying than any army of men. She proved that love, when corrupted by loss, creates a blast radius that can consume cities. We want our saints to be pure. We want our monsters to be irredeemable. Olga refuses to be either. She stands in the grey wasteland between survival and savagery, challenging us to judge her. She buried men alive to protect her son. She burned a city to avenge her husband. She bowed her head to God to save her soul. So, as the smoke finally clears and we look back at the burning horizon of the 10th century, we are left with one final question. It is a question that depends entirely on where you are standing, whether you are inside the walls of Iskorosten or safe in the future she built. Do you think they were a victim or a villain? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see more stories where history is darker than fiction, click the video on your screen right now. I'll see you there.